shadows in the dark. Don't trust what you cannot see.
Hello, everybody. I am CheeseSlice. I'm here with Gloria, Guillo, and Jeremey Kuzmarov. We are going to record an hour session for WBAI and Progressive Radio Network. So, hello, Gloria and Jeremey.
Hey, Jayme and Jeremey, long time no see.
We are going to talk about two articles from that Jeremey has found and wanted to look into. So, Gloria, go ahead, take it away. We got an hour to record. Let's do it.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined here today by a resident expert, Jeremey Kuzmarov. Jeremey is a professor at Tulsa Community College, a historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of CovertAction magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today's show is on Africa, minerals, and U.S. foreign policy. We will unpack Jeremey's recent article in CovertAction magazine titled, Think Tank Report Makes Clear Minerals Are Key Drivers of U.S. Foreign Policy. It was published on April 16th. Colonialism never ended. It has only changed its clothes. At its core, colonialism is the appropriation of foreign resources, the systematic extraction of wealth from one land to feed the engines of power of the predator class in another. And it depends, absolutely, on the deliberate underdevelopment of the people and land it exploits. Today, the so-called critical minerals, cobalt, lithium, rare earths, are the new gold, the new rubber, the new cotton. And as Jeremey's excellent article lays bare, U.S. foreign policy is being openly shaped to secure these resources under the banner of national security and supply chain resilience. But strip away the euphemisms, and what remains is the same centuries-old logic. Ensure that resource-rich nations, particularly in Africa and Latin America, remain fractured, dependent, and unable to develop independent economic power. Peace treaties, aid programs, strategic partnerships are dressed up as benevolence, but are instead instruments of control. In the Congo, for example, American diplomatic efforts claim to seek stability, but only to the extent that the mines can keep operating, the minerals can keep flowing, and American companies can secure their profits without disruption. The result is a vicious structural imbalance. The global South sends out raw materials at bargain prices, while the global North, armed with capital, military power, and trade rules it wrote itself, sells back finished products at a premium. Wealth moves upward. Poverty and conflict stay rooted in place. This is structural violence on a planetary scale. It's a system that pretends to bring development, but instead ensures that actual development, the kind that would allow nations to retain their own resources, build their own industries, and serve their own people, is always just out of reach. Colonialism did not end. It metastasized into a global economy that demands underdevelopment in order to survive. And until we confront and dismantle these structural trade imbalances, every policy about stabilization, every summit about development and democracy will simply be a new chapter in the same old story of theft. Jeremey, please take it away and explain your lovely article.
Well, sure. Well, Gloria, yeah, that was really an excellent introduction. And my article was prompted by a leading think tank, Center for Strategic and International Studies, published a book-length study called "Critical Minerals and the Future of the U.S. Economy," edited by Gracelyn Bescaron and Duncan Wood, who work for the think tank, and I think are educated in elite schools in England and the United States. And I mean, this is what the Marxist left always said, and they were kind of pilloried as determinists. But I mean, this report lays bare the interest of extracting the mineral wealth of Africa and throughout the world. And I mean, it's pretty out in the open now. Trump was talking. I mean, most people understand that the reason Trump wants to take over Greenland is because there are a lot of untapped mineral in Greenland, and that could be a potential bonanza. And we see with the growth of Silicon Valley. I mean, they are particularly interested in exploiting minerals that are needed for computers and AI systems that they want to develop. And Tesla with the clean energy economy, it's not so clean. I mean, it relied on the extraction of mineral, to create the electric cars. It requires copper and a lot of minerals that you're discussing. So it's leading to this intensified grab for these mineral wealth, and it's pretty out in the open with Trump. I mean, he was even saying with Ukraine, we can't keep giving you money unless you give us your mineral wealth. And then he wants to discuss an alternative agreement with Putin. So it's right out in the open. But this report, just has a lot of detail about the interest. It expresses great alarm that China is developing control over minerals throughout Africa. And China is kind of smarter and shrewder than the United States and traditional colonial powers, because they do give back a lot to the African country. They invest a lot in infrastructure. I mean, it doesn't mean they don't have the same agenda of taking control over mineral resources, but they ingratiate themselves more. They are less violent. They don't coordinate the same kind of coups that the U.S. is notorious, and CIA are notorious for. So they're actually winning the great game. And I mean, this great game has been going on for generations and centuries, and it's kept the third world down. And U.S. foreign policy has always been a purpose underlying U.S. foreign policy: keep the third world down, make sure destabilize regions, or impose right-wing neoliberal governments that will allow access of Western multinational corporations of the mineral wealth. Of course, this report, the authors claim that multinational corporations in the West somehow are benign institutions. uh, it makes the point, it's quoted in my article, that they're shown throughout history to be moral agents or something, which is a ludicrous claim. I mean, just look at some of the lawsuits, in a country like Colombia. It just comes to the top of my head, where Chiquita Banana, and they're funding death squad operation to protect their control. Or look at the history of the United Fruit Company in Cuba and Guatemala, and the kind of gangster method they used. Or some of these mining corporations, like in Zambia or Congo, the environmental consequences. I've traveled to the Copper Belt area in Zambia, and the air is foul there, and there's so much pollution. It's disgusting. It's all caused by these mines that are owned by largely Western companies. So, and the report
And they also use child labor.
yeah, yeah, and you find just such a horrific poverty. And I mean, as we discussed on this show, U.S. foreign policy acts like gangsters. They impose governments. Anytime a left-wing government comes in that will try and improve working condition and impose new laws like that occurred here in the New Deal. We had child labor in the United States in the Gilded Age, and it took years of struggle And eventually we got laws under the New Deal and some of its predecessors to, outlaw child labor. Of course, some of the Republicans want to bring back child labor now. And minimum wage was set up, an 8-hour day, and regulation of the safety of the workplace. I mean, it's obviously been imperfect in our country, but they don't have those laws in a lot of countries, and that's great for the multinational corporations. And then when a government, God forbid, a left government comes in that tries to put in New Deal type legislation or wants to tax companies more so that they have revenue to develop their economy, or the worst, nationalization, that's when the CIA moves in the demonization starts, and then the CIA comes in to get rid of that government pretty quickly.
So what you're saying, that if a leader of a given country is nationalistic and supports their people, then they're removed. And if a leader is a traitor and bought off and sacrifices the country's minerals and people, they're supported by the United States and kept in power. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's a long historical pattern of that. I think in that article, although I've covered this in the last 5 years in many articles in CovertAction magazine, detailing this, and there are well-known and documented cases like the 53 Iran coup, when Mohammad Mossadegh tried to nationalize Iran's oil, and he was overthrown in a CIA coup. Guatemala 54, Jacobo Arbenz, in that case, he just tried to buy some fallow land from the United Fruit Company and set a minimum wage standard and impose some regulations of the fruit company. And the Dulles brothers, who ran the foreign policy, were on the had been corporate lawyers representing that company or on the board. And the CIA moved in, overthrew Arbenz. Sukarno was a socialist Indonesia. They overthrew him, put in this murderous right-wing dictatorship. Chile 73, Allende. He tried to nationalize the copper industry. CIA helped coordinate his downfall. So, and then you can look at more contemporary cases. And my article goes
I'd say that's a yes, Jeremy.
yeah, and then we can discuss more contemporary case. Now Zambia is an important country because it has a lot of copper. It's number 2 behind Chile in copper. And now the U.S. built a huge embassy in Zambia, and they moved AFRICOM there, and they're supporting this right-wing government led by Hakainde Hichilema, who one of the wealthiest men in Zambia, who was involved in very shady privatization initiatives in the 90s that he personally profited off of, because Zambia had a socialist government from 64 through the late 80s, early 90s, led by Kenneth Kaunda. He nationalized the copper industry. And I actually traveled in Zambia because my ex-wife was from there. And all the books in the libraries are from the 60s and 70s. When the mines were nationalized, the government had a lot of revenue, and they invested in education, in healthcare. They really built up the infrastructure. And since the privatization era, neoliberalism, the country is totally dilapidated. Its infrastructure is not upgraded. You go to the library, they're a great book. For me as a historian, it was great because there were a lot of great books from the 60s and 70s and more left-leaning bent. I had a great time, but that's not good for the country that all their books are from the 60s and 70s, because the government doesn't invest in education or books. They have no money for that because they privatize the mine. It's owned by foreign corporations who pay almost no taxes. And Hichilema is exactly the kind of leader they want, because he cut the tax rate even further, and further privatized all the mining, and so the government has little revenue from their own resource, and there's limited regulation as far as the environment. That's why the environmental costs are horrible. The wages are really low. The poverty there, it's out of a Charles Dickens novel. You just see kids in rags trying to sell you something on the street because all the wealth has been siphoned out of the country, and Hichilema is not doing anything to improve the situation. So he's just giving fealty to these foreign corporations. And I found in my research, I don't think it's mentioned in that report, but Gates and Bezos have investments in a big mining project, and he's helping to green light that. And it's a Silicon Valley, and it's these bigwigs here in the United States that see great opportunity in Zambia, but the country's not going to see any return with a leader like Hichilema, and the U.S. is helping to fund him and support him in various ways, and that's the pattern. And you can look at Congo and how the U.S. supported the Rwanda and Uganda invasion. That's one of the worst human rights abuses. All this talk of humanitarian intervention, but the U.S. was on the side of the aggressors in Congo, who the Rwandan and Ugandans, who repeatedly invaded Congo to plunder its resources and to impose. Rwanda even imposed a quisling leader named Hippolyte Kanambe, who they gave the name Joseph Kabila, to allow Western corporations to come in and plunder. And some of the corporations, were donors to the Clinton Foundation. This policy goes back to the 90s, after the Rwandan Patriotic Front was the U.S. proxy that came in Rwanda and the genocide. And they actually killed a majority, or at least equivalent of the Rwandan genocide, were killed by the U.S. proxy, Rwandan Patriotic Front. And the U.S., Clinton, starting with Clinton, gave huge arms to them and intelligence support, and U.S. mercenary companies helped them to invade and plunder Congo and impose a quisling named Hippolyte Kanambe. And Congo is just totally weakened and destabilized, and that's what they like, because they can move in the vultures and extract the mineral wealth of Congo, which is enormous. And what they don't want is Lumumba. Going back to the 60s, the CIA overthrew Patrice Lumumba. He had tried to impose a socialist government and to nationalize the mining, and so the revenue can be used to build the Congolese economy for the Congolese people, and to impose good wages. But he was quickly assassinated, and the CIA put in Joseph Mobutu, who's infamous dictator in that country. So there's a long pattern, and it's continuously playing out, and we're seeing it kind of ramped up in steroid, because in certain countries that have valuable resources like copper, which is needed in this mislabeled clean energy revolution. And don't get me wrong, I do agree, fossil fuel are bad too, and it's a good idea, but we have to recognize that it's not such a clean energy when they're going into these countries, plundering them and destroying their environment to mine the minerals. So, we have to think of other alternatives, like changing our own lifestyles, or developing better public transport so we don't have to rely so much on cars, that kind of thing. But the power elite doesn't want that, especially when you have figures like an Elon Musk, so influential in dictating policy, or other than Silicon Valley buying off both parties. That kind of discussion is never had.
Well, one thing that we tend to see a lot of also in these countries and when the CIA supports a puppet in a particular country, is we see these black markets thrive. And in these black markets, we see prostitution, sex slavery, weapons. We see all kinds of violence that really comes out of this, and drugs. So it's like a trifecta also that kind of underlies this. So there's actually almost like these two economies. Are we seeing that in Africa also?
Absolutely, yeah. It provokes just a complete moral breakdown, and I mean, people are desperate for survival. And on the other hand, you also have this artificial wealth. I think some of it because there are a lot of riches, and foreigners come in to extract the riches, and some of them live there, whether temporarily or not. But they live very lavish lifestyle. They drive fancy cars, and that, and unfortunately, American culture has a huge influence. I observed this when I traveled there. And a lot of youth, they see American movies and they see all the wealth, and they want it for themselves. So the only way they can get it is through gangs or crime. But I mean, when their leaders are criminals, then it facilitates this complete moral breakdown of society, and the whole value system is skewed. So it's sad, really, to observe.
And the other thing we tend to see is that in these areas where there's lawlessness, that people live in terror, and they're less inclined to speak out. They're less inclined to resist economic situations and employment situations. They're terrified. So it's also in some ways allowing this black market and this criminal element to thrive. It also is a method of social control, would you say?
I would say so, yeah. And yeah, I mean, the regime in Congo, I know it was a terrorist regime that was imposed by the Rwandans, with backing of the U.S. and U.K., and he murdered many people, Hippolyte Kanambe, including allegedly his own sister. Uh, and I mean, also, there isn't good education system. A lot of youth, the underdevelopment is so stark. And education is important for the development of social movement. People have to have an understanding of the political system, and how it needs to be changed, and also understanding of how foreign powers manipulate their own politics. But if people are mal-educated, I mean, neoliberal governments invest nothing in education. So their libraries, schools where there are no books. And a lot of kids are just street, youth. They're lost youth. A lot of cases they've had parents killed, in the war, like Congo. So many young men are killed, or women. And then you have compounding that these health epidemics, including AIDS. So there are many orphans. Education. A lot of youth are not properly educated, and that's another factor. I mean, I certainly agree with you. Yeah, these are terroristic governments, and regular people are just living in fear, just trying to survive. It's very difficult to survive in those countries, regular people, even if a lot of the jobs are based on pure nepotism. And even if you have a good job, it doesn't match the cost of living. So people, it's very hard life there. And yeah, it's not conducive to the building of political movements for change in those societies. And unfortunately, our population is just oblivious. We enjoy the trapping of a certain lifestyle here. And the average person in the West, United States, really doesn't pay attention to political developments. People are not aware of how our government manipulates things or provokes conflicts and keeps people impoverished. And we tend to embrace stereotypes that are commensurate with the colonialism, that the Africans are backward and we're superior to them. And so if anybody cares at all, there's this paternalistic attitude, and there's never any effort to change policy and to support movements for economic sovereignty in those countries.
We've discussed on other shows how this lack of education is not an oversight or done because there's more pressing things to spend money on, but a lack of education is a tool of control, keeping people unable to read, keeping people unable to do basic math, um, or to understand finance or government or things like that. People are more easy to manipulate and manage. And even in the United States, we saw that there were these hideous rules during slavery and after slavery where if someone was to even murder, even not only beatings and financial penalties, but also murder for teaching a slave to read or a former slave to read. I mean, it's amazing on how the ruling elite the predator class, as I prefer to call them, focuses on denying intellectual capacity to control, our population and also that of other countries. And Jeremey is a professor and has taught in many different universities. And as long as professors such as Jeremey, and we've had some other professors on our show, Dan Kovalik and Danny Shaw, and anytime any of our good professors, our professors who speak the truth, try to educate, they're marginalized and removed from teaching. And the only professors that seem to be getting these, big contracts and these fancy things are professors who teach a prevailing narrative, which is full of lies. And some jokes that we've seen is that the fake president, the former fake president of Venezuela, got a gig in Miami. Well, I forgot his name now. He's
Juan Guaido.
Juan Guaido. Yeah, Juan Guaido. And then I think another hack that you wrote about, Jeremey, got a gig at Harvard. Right.
Jake Sullivan, who was supposedly the intellectual brains behind the Biden administration foreign policy, which, as we discussed on this show, bred horror after horror. Whether it's provoking the conflict in Ukraine has caused 1 million deaths, whether it's arming the Israelis as they commit genocide, whether it's supporting these regime change operations in third world countries. Sullivan has his hand on that, and he was an aide to Hillary Clinton. He's a key figure behind the Russiagate hoax. He's a big hawk on Syria, on Libya, that brought Libya back into slavery and caused a biblical scale humanitarian crisis in Syria. And he was just given the prestigious appointment at Harvard. And my article, I detail all these war hawks on the Harvard faculty, like Samantha Power. And I found a review of Power, who was the National Security Advisor under Barack Obama, and she teaches at the Human Rights Center in Harvard, which is a joke. And a review of her book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, found the level of scholarship to be not up to par for a high school student, that she presented these caricatured depictions of international conflicts. And in her first chapter, she heroized a war propagandist named Henry Morgenthau, who served in the Wilson administration. So the intellectual caliber is extremely low. And this is Harvard, as well as the moral character is absolutely abysmal. And as far as, trying to understand the political economy, perhaps that's why you get these Cambridge-educated people who write in this report that Western multinational corporations are moral beacons to humanity. That's what she wrote in this minerals report. And anybody who has any experience on the ground in third world countries, or who knows anything about the labor history of the United States and the brutal repression meted out to strikers during the early 1900s, which is documented in many books, would not say that these are great moral agents. But that labor history is often not taught in school. It's very rarely taught. There are some good labor historians, I think, who've secured positions, but it was more taught in the 60s and 70s. There was a more radical turn with the Vietnam War and 60s movements, and that history was taught more, but there had been a conservative pushback. So even that labor history in the United States is not much taught. And as far as international affairs, it's usually just taught from a certain kind of official narrative. And the history of colonialism, like I used to teach a course on colonialism, and we would look at colonial empires, and the last third of the course would look at the United States as a kind of heir, the British and the French. And we looked at, as your monologue pointed out, just some of the continuities today, and how the U.S. is a more indirect form of colonialism, but nevertheless there's the same underlying agendas and some of the same methods that the United States has consistently used that compares to foreign, European colonial empires, including the use of proxy forces, Same counterinsurgency methods, and they often drew, like in the Vietnam War, British consultants who had worked in suppressing colonial revolts, like in Malaya. They brought them to Vietnam to help the United States. So that's something we looked at a bit in my course. But as you pointed out, professor like myself, and when I showed the political science guy my syllabus, he like gave me some funny look. And then he showed me his syllabus, and he had, Francis Fukuyama, all these neocon writers, and all this anti-Russia stuff. And that's what they like these days, instead of a real education. And then our population, sadly, is cut off from the suffering bred by a lot of our policies. And that's very sad, I think, because especially, if you have empathy for the people who have to grow up and live in extremely difficult circumstance and are so badly exploited, they try and make a living. It's heartbreaking.
It is. It is. Living with this knowledge isn't easy, and I guess we're able to do it because there's groups of us and we can discuss this stuff. I guess some members of our audience are more isolated and alone in their thoughts. We talk about the whole concept of not wanting to know some things because it's distressing. And, I think it's our obligation, and I mean, we really are blessed to be in this country. And we really do have a nice life relative to other countries. And it's my personal belief that it's our obligation to know what's going on with our tax dollars. It seems, our moral imperative to understand what our country does. And for some reason, it's unpleasant for people to understand the truth, so they just want to not look at it. But I really urge our audience to, it is a little difficult, it is a little painful to really look at things and see, but it's our moral obligation and our ethical obligation to see what goes on.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do have a hard time recognizing that our comfort, as lucky as we have it here, a lot of that comfort is the result of exploitative practices around the world, and toward, it's rooted in the genocide of the Native Americans and the theft of their lands, and people just don't want to acknowledge that. Because it implicates us that maybe we have it too good here, and we have to rethink some things. I mean, ultimately, human happiness is not contingent on how much wealth you have. It's contingent on your friendships, your family life, your finding hobbies that you enjoy, finding a career where you feel you can do something positive. You don't need elaborate wealth to be happy, and a lot of rich people are not happy. So we have to think of it in those terms, that maybe some of our wealth is stolen. We do these harmful things around the world. How can we change our lifestyle? I think that should be a conversation, but people don't want to go there. And then there are these financial interests that profit so much off that exploitation and off the political skullduggery and manipulation, and they control the narrative, they control the education system, so they further block that. But as we've been saying on this show, we need to fight back against our ruler because they are corrupt and they're morally perverse, and that's not a way to live. To have a good or a genuinely good life, really, I think, is about being a good person, so.
Jeremy, you wanted to discuss the Canadian election. It seems from the article you sent me, the new Democratic Party, NDP, Social Democrats, is controlled opposition since it doesn't seem to focus or represent the working class and working class issues and forwards neoliberal policies. I guess the good news is that it has flopped in the polls because people see through the smoke and mirrors, like with the Green and Democratic parties in the US and with Sanders and AOC's propaganda festival tour. Please tell us your perspective. You grew up in Canada, right? How was it and how is it now? Thank you.
Correct. Well, I don't think it's good news that they flopped, in the sense that when the left completely implodes, it allows it pushes the spectrum further and further to the right. And many people are disaffected with the mainstream parties. In the U.S. the Democratic Party, in Canada be the Liberal Party. But since there's no left wing, there's no real left wing alternative, so they have nowhere to turn. And then the conservatives can attract them, and a lot of people misguidedly support the conservatives as a vehicle of change somehow, when they really have a very regressive economic program, both in Canada and the United States. So there are a lot of similarities, and I think our show Left on Left is looks at the weakness of the left, uh, and it's resulting in the ever more rightward shift and the ever more entrenchment of corporate power. And I think we should see this not just as an American phenomenon, but a North American one, and also broadly throughout the Western world. It's occurring in Europe as well. So if you look at the Canadian landscape, I mean, this corporate liberal, you can't have a more corporate figure than a newly elected Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, who served, the Bank of England. This is a wealthy banker who's not really a liberal. He should really be in the conservative, just like as we've discussed, the Democrats, a lot of them, the dominant ones, are really neoconservatives who promote a hawkish foreign policy, and they're retreating on the New Deal and serve more of the wealthy classes. The Republican Party in the U.S. has now moved to the far right of the spectrum, and that's kind of the same in Canada. So, I mean, there are some differences because Canada has a free healthcare system. Now, that's how the NDP was formed, because Canada did have a more leftward trajectory than the United States in the Cold War and immediate post-Cold War era, because the NDP emerged as a legitimate, more left-wing third party that we don't have in the United States. And the NDP was founded by Tommy Douglas, who's a hero in Canada, because he pioneered the free healthcare system that they have in Canada. He had been the premier of Saskatchewan in the 1950s, and he pioneered free healthcare in Saskatchewan, and then advanced it throughout Canada. And it became the model for the Canadian healthcare system. And Tommy Douglas was very progressive on a lot of issues. He promoted nationalization of core natural resources. And that's a key and core industry, and like a utility and utilities, like the Socialist Party had done that in the United States when they existed in the early 1900s. And that is a big issue for Canada also, because United States corporations are very influential in Canada, and there's concern about American companies gobbling up their resources. So the nationalization program was very progressive and important from a Canadian nationalist standpoint, just like these countries we're talking about, like Zambia or Congo. That's really what they need to take back control over their natural resources. And Douglas had generally very progressive policies. He was also against various wars like Vietnam. He was under RCMP surveillance. This is like the equivalent of the FBI. They had a file of like 1,000 pages on him. And one of the files showed he was working with some American anti-war activists in the Vietnam era, like Jane Fonda. So, I mean, Douglas is, a very honorable figure who helped found the NDP party as a genuinely progressive third party. So it's sad to see it in the condition it is today, because if you look, I sent one of the links. Yves Engler is a good academic in Canada, and his website shows how the NDP, like in their foreign policy positions, are abhorrent. They supported Ukraine war to the hilt. They supported the expansion of Canada, because Canada, the same problem we have here of overspending on the military. Canada, is known, or at least has a reputation, as much less militaristic than the United States. But in the last two decades, its military budget has expanded exponentially. And it's gone along with the United States and all the ill-begotten war that we've been discussing, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and they've gone along in all those wars. And NDP has supported it. They supported the war in Libya and Syria, Ukraine. they backtracked. They were kind of weak on Israel, Palestine, and they have now come out and said it's a genocide. But on the other hand, the NDP had this foreign policy critic who was meeting with this neoconservative, ardent, pro-Israel, to the point that he was supporting the Israeli far right. A guy, Erwin Kotler, she met with him and gave him all kind of respect. So on foreign policy, they're just terrible. And they made a bargain that they were there to support the Liberal Party against the Conservatives. So they basically caved in, and instead of presenting a left alternative to the Liberals, they just went along with all their policies to try and build a coalition against the Conservative, but they undercut their whole party. And of course, the COVID, they went along. The left was horrible, as we've discussed on our show, on COVID, and Canada had some of the worst COVID policies. They had the country was turned into a police state under COVID. They even had curfews, and kids were out of school much longer in the United States, and that was horrible for kids. The distance learning did not work, and set back reading levels. And NDP was full to the hilt on COVID. So it just
one other thing that
stinks. I mean,
one
what can
other
you
thing
say?
that
And nobody's voting for them. They have their number. They did very well about 10 years ago. They got a lot of seats. In this election, they only got about 7 or 8 seats. So they're completely marginalized now, because there's no point in voting for them. You might as well vote for the Liberals. They have basically the same platform as Canada's Liberal Party, which is more and more of a corporate party like our Democrats.
I forgot what I was going to say now, but Jeremey, you grew up in Canada or you lived in Canada? Could you talk about your personal experience in Canada? Also, I do recall that in the 70s, Canada was the place to go. All the people who were not wanting to fight in Vietnam were going to Canada to hide out. The boasting of the healthcare system was fantastic. Everybody felt very comfortable with it. I have some Canadian friends. I don't think the healthcare system is up to the same level it was back then. I think one of the most egregious things I've heard from my Canadian friends is when they had the COVID lockdowns, people were actually prevented from leaving Canada. Now, you could understand people being blocked from returning to Canada or traveling to Canada, but people were even blocked from leaving. And it's quite interesting on how the countries that are still controlled somewhat by England had the most aggressive COVID policies. We think of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have being some of the most egregious, where human rights were just, taken away, and political rights were just swept, right from under people.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that. And Tommy Douglas stood up, because in the '60s there was a revolt in Quebec, and there was a small, terrorist group that kidnapped a British official and carried out some terrorist acts because they were promoting Quebec separatism. And Trudeau overreacted. This is Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He imposed the War Measures Act in 1970 when he was the prime minister, and they arrested like 500 people who had nothing. Most of them had nothing to do with these rather isolated terrorist acts, and they were arresting like trade union leaders. But Tommy Douglas stood up against that. He spoke out against the War Measures Act and supported civil liberties. But the NDP today did not do that. As you pointed out, the COVID is leading more toward police state measures and totalitarianism. And Trudeau was actually found, Justin Trudeau, culpable when they had these truckers' protests in Ottawa. These were truckers who were against the mask mandates and a lot of these, draconian policies. And whether you agree with them or not, they have a right to protest and express their view in a democratic society. But Trudeau, Justin, like his father had done in Quebec in 1970, invoked emergency measures, and he had them some of the leaders arrested, and he accused them of various offenses, and he was found culpable in an investigation for violating civil liberty. People were put in jail for peaceful protest. And where was the NDP to condemn that violation of civil liberty, like Tommy Douglas had done with the War Measures Act? And yeah, the left party, as we discussed, should be anti-imperialist, for the working people, and that the government should invest in economic program development and expand education and healthcare and construct a social program, not spending on warfare and foreign policy interventions that are pro-imperialistic and advance the interests of the American empire and American corporations. But NDP is not a real left party. They're not really supporting working class struggles either. They align more with the trade union bureaucracy, which often sells out workers and blocks strikes that are needed or sells them out in different ways. And one other point that relates to our earlier discussion is that Canada has a lot of mining because they have a lot of natural resources, and the mining industry is big in Canada, and they have these big companies that are very active in Zambia and Africa, like Barrick Gold is one. There's another one that's very well known. The name escapes me, but some of these companies are infamous for their human rights, bad labor practices in third world countries, and just extracting a lot of mineral wealth from those countries. So Canadian foreign policy has become more and more right wing and morally offensive, and just supporting the interests of these mining conglomerates. And where are the NDP to push back against that for human rights? They're not criticizing the Liberal Party foreign policy, which is pro-corporate, and the Conservatives are jingoistic, so they're a real danger, and they're no alternative. But I know a lot of people in Canada, they have legitimate reasons they don't like the Liberals, so they were supporting Conservative in this election. I think they're misguided, like people here in the U.S. who thought Trump would end the war, so they shifted to Republican. But Trump is regressive in so many ways and fascistic leaning. But it's the failure of the left that leaves people in the abyss and makes them prey to these conservative demagogues like Trump or Pierre Poilievre in Canada. And they use the anti-immigrant strategy of blaming immigrants for social problems. We need to rebuild the left here in the United States and in Canada, because the weakness of the left is just skewing policy in a very dangerous and terrible direction, as we've discussed on this show.
Well, one of the things we talk about a lot is controlled opposition, and I've always felt that my personal belief is that the Green Party is controlled opposition. And from what you're telling me, it seems like the NDP has become controlled opposition. So when I use the word flop, kind of positively, it's that people are waking up to this controlled opposition. People are demanding a party that actually represents them and isn't a diversion and a pressure valve to take them away from their suffering, where they think they're doing something, but they're really not. So would you say that the NDP may be controlled opposition the same way, in my belief, the Green Party is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how that would work, but it makes sense what you're saying. If somebody had made a decision, has pushed the party in this rightward direction, and that's counterproductive to its own interests as a party, because it's lost so many seats. The seats it once gained, it has lost to now being totally irrelevant with only about 6 or 7 seats. So it's self-destruction. And that, yeah, as we've discussed on the show, that is one agent provocateur and infiltrator. That is often their goal, to destroy these parties. And I reviewed this book about where it's well documented. This guy named William A. Carsey, there's a biography of him. He was a provocateur in the 19th century. He was a Democratic Party operative who would infiltrate any new parties or labor groups to deliberately sabotage their operations and weaken them. And there are various things he did, whether it's creating internal conflicts in the organization or just adopting regressive positions so that there would be no point to joining that group if you're real progressive. So I'm sure that's what has occurred. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know exactly how that process has played out, but it makes sense what you're saying. And the
Well,
quality of leader has been very poor compared to some great leaders who helped found the party, like Tommy Douglas, who wasn't perfect, but he had a lot going for him, and there was a real alternative with him to the mainstream, pro-corporate, pro-war policies.
well,
Gloria.
Jeremy, talk about your youth in Canada. Like, what happened?
Well, I grew up in Montreal and Quebec, so the language politics was kind of at the forefront in Quebec, and that's a complex story that I don't know we want to go into here. It's less a matter of left versus right. There were some legitimate grievances that the francophone population had in Quebec, like I was discussing. The uproar, it was kind of known as the Quiet Revolution in the '60s, and they were influenced by the '60s movements in the United States, the Black Power movement, because they saw themselves oppressed. That they're this Anglo elite that dominated, even though the francophone were the majority in the province of Quebec. The Anglophones, dominated the economy and dominated the political structure. And they also rebelled against the church because they felt that the church had bred conservatism in them. And they ultimately captured power at the provincial level. And then they imposed a lot of language laws, and a lot of English left the province of Quebec or left Montreal, has become more of a French city. So I was more enmeshed in that kind of politics, but there is more of a left-leaning bent in Quebec. It is more of socialistic. The taxes are higher, but there's more investment in education. University, and I was a beneficiary because I went to McGill University, and the tuition was very low, and my parents could pay the tuition. I lived at home, so I had no debt. And then I went to graduate school in the United States. I was able to get a scholarship to pay my fees, so I never had any student debt. So I benefited from a more socialistic system, and then you had free healthcare. So I've always had a more left-leaning approach to government because I see the benefit. People don't have to go into debt in a more socialistic system to pursue their education, and when they get sick, they're worried just about getting better. And I mean, there are problems. It's not a perfect healthcare system, but it is a very good healthcare system. There are a lot of good doctors, and usually you can get the care you need in a timely manner. I mean, sometimes big city hospitals are busy, so you might wait at the emergency, but that could happen in American cities as well. Overall, the quality of healthcare is very high, but I agree with you. It is concerning that the government is cutting back on things like healthcare, and they're spending more on the military, and the quality may constantly decline. And that's why the direction of policy in Canada is very disturbing. Under both conservative, they had Stephen Harper, who was this Bush-type conservative, and he started this rightward trend. But Justin Trudeau was a disaster. He continued with these pro-corporate, neoliberal, pro-war, pro-militaristic policies. And the quality of life, I agree, is starting to go down in Canada. And he was promoting this more these totalitarian measures under the COVID lockdown. And the foreign policy is completely aligned with these mining interests, a lot of them are very shady and corrupt. And they've corrupted a lot of universities. For instance, Barrick Gold, their owner, funded this Monk Institute at the University of Toronto, the big foreign policy institute. It's all funded by Barrick Gold, and its CEO, and he's involved in the plunder in Africa and all these abhorrent practices. And I once applied for a job there, but they didn't even consider my application. I mean, it's not an objective education. So these financiers are corrupting the education system in Canada, just like here in the United States. There's a lot of parallel between the two countries. And yeah, some Americans have this idea of Canada as kind of liberal oasis, and really it's not. It has a lot of the same problems in its political structure as the United States, and same problems in its media and educational institutions. Although I mean, the school I went to did have some good courses and good teachers, and there was some topics I think were covered well. Some of the areas were discussing like colonialism we were covered in some of our courses. There were a lot more left-leaning, liberal type professors. So I would say I got a good education. It was a pretty open environment, but there are some disturbing patterns there as well as here in education that we've covered a bit on this show.
Two things about Canada recently has kind of made me concerned. Well, one was they kind of were the first to do this financial crackdown for the truckers and seizing their assets and freezing their assets. And I think that really set a very chilling tone, because that's something that we're concerned with, internationally. It's not just there. If there's digital currency, if there is a way that, we can be kind of controlled, then anytime any of us say something that the predator class doesn't like, they can hit a button and we're just cut off from all our resources. So I think that was a very frightening trend that Canada kind of experimented with. And, that's concerning to me. I'd like you to comment on that. I also have one more thing that really freaks me out about Canada, is this assisted suicide. It just keeps in what I'm reading, it just seems to keep expanding. I mean, first of all, it started out, okay, well, if you're a terminal patient and you want to die, you don't want to go through chemotherapy or whatever, medieval treatment that they can extract wealth from you, using. So you decide you want to die. Okay, I can understand that. But now it's kind of rolled out to mental patients. If you're depressed, you're encouraged to for assisted suicide. I think that's a very slippery slope. And then I've recently heard, and I haven't really investigated this, but there's chatter out there that if you consider yourself too poor, you're homeless, you have no resources, that you could get assisted suicide. And that is really, in my opinion, one of the most terrifying things. So I don't know if you've come across those things yet, or,
Well, and one thing I'd like to add, there are a lot of disturbing trajectories in Canadian politics, and it was disturbing when this woman, Chrystia Freeland, has been very influential in liberal governments. She's the granddaughter of a Ukrainian Nazi, and she's gung-ho pro-Ukraine. And Canada has really jumped on the Ukraine bandwagon, this Russophobia, and that's been disturbing. And when they even celebrated a Nazi officer, who's Ukrainian, was given a standing ovation in the parliament, and then they realized after he was a Nazi, and Trudeau kind of backtracked, but they went along with this Ukraine in a very disturbing way. And one thing that's disturbing related to the NDP is that if they're a real opposition party, they could really hammer on these foreign policies. But by not doing so, by embracing the dominant narrative about Ukraine and how bad Russia is and how bad China is, they stifle any debate. Because that's one thing an opposition party could achieve, is to really open up the debate and open up this critique, and more people will see that and they get access to the airwaves. But instead, they're just going along with this Russophobic and xenophobic narratives and the narrative of U.S. foreign policy. So there's no real debate in Canada, just like here in the United States. So the intellectual life is no better in Canada than it is in the U.S. right now.
Well, Jeremy, please tell our audience how they can follow your important work and financially support your efforts.
Yeah, please support me at CovertAction magazine, where my articles are published, and that's a magazine that investigates or has a history of investigating the CIA and covert operations, and also provides a political economic analysis of U.S. imperialism that's lacking in the mainstream and alternative media, as we've discussed on this show. And then my Substack is Jeremey Kuzmarov at Substack, and it's too hot for the mainstream.
Well, thank you. That wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jeremey Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Okay, that was good.
Okay.
I think it was good.
Jayme,
the last segment was pretty good, so hopefully you can include that.
Yeah, I can fix that. Yeah, I can fix all
Okay.
that. So
That's
that'll
it for
wrap it up.
today.
I'm glad we
Yeah,
got the Canada stuff. I think that was good.
Yeah, that'll wrap it up
very
for
good.
today. My feeling on the healthcare in Canada, though, it's like it used to be pretty good, but it's gotten worse and worse and worse as they've tried to turn it into the United States system.
Yeah, that could
So
be.
the
Yeah.
more they make it like ours, the worse it gets. And that's the same thing happening in the UK and everywhere else. Like privatization of healthcare just gets worse results, and like we're the poster child of it, and everybody's trying to copy our model. It's crazy. So if anybody's watching around the world, don't let them turn it into the United States system, because we have probably the worst. Although we have good doctors, just a bad system for payments and everything like that. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about before we get out of here?
I think
No,
we're
I'd
good.
rather run but thanks. Yeah, those were good shows. Thank you, Jayme.
Thank you,
All right.
everybody.
No
Some
problem.
point.
Thank you,
Okay.
Jeremy. And for
Take care,
everybody who is
guys.
watching this at home, thank you for watching. And we'll be back next week with another episode. Have a good one.